Hey, all you lovely people on Patreon. As promised, the bonus MxTRA for Season 8, Episode 18, which was on Producers of the 90s, is a history of the Loudness Wars. Now, I've been fascinated by this since I knew about it, which has been a damn long time. I probably became aware of it in the 2000s, but, you'll see that it existed even before then. I am not an audiophile. I am not a gearhead. In fact, I plan to do an episode maybe this season, on answers to questions I don't care about. For example, what kind of guitar did so-and-so play? I don't care. I have a more punk aesthetic which is that give me an instrument that's in decent shape, I'll make it sound good. Like that kind of a thing. I don't need things to be exactly X or Y. And as to an audiophile, great speakers and great systems are great, and pristine production is super, but a good song rules everything, no matter how you hear it. And that said, I am fascinated by changes in production values and recording quality, and I have to be because I'm a producer. And I am fascinated by the reasons why they occurred. So as with every history I've done, the history of the Loudness Wars stretches way farther back than you'd ever guess. But before we get to that history, let's do a definition. What are the Loudness Wars? What were they? It's kind of like a musical arms race. How much louder and more consistently louder could producers and engineers make music so as to have more of an attention-getting presence? It's basic human nature that louder things call attention more than softer in and out of music. So if I start talking like this and you were just listening somewhere, and then you're like, oh my God, why the hell is that dude yelling? I just got your attention in a way that maybe I didn't have it before. That's what loudness does. Note that the graphic for this episode consists of 3 waveforms of one of my songs. I haven't picked the song yet. I don't know. Maybe it'll be, I don't know. I haven't decided. And those waveforms show the difference in overall loudness. I'll put a link to whatever song I end up picking in the text, but and the song won't be featured here. What I'm showing you is the waveform, because that kind of illustrates the Loudness Wars right there. Just be able to see it, and we'll talk more about the tech behind how this is achieved later on. But let's get into the timeline now. So as early as the 1940s, with jukeboxes and including radio play, record labels realized that songs mastered louder than others would stand out and attract more attention from the listeners. There's a side note that normalization, which we've come to be familiar with because it's used for streaming, was already part of the landscape as far back as the 40s, because jukebox owners would have the ability to preset the maximum level of music. So that's more of a limiter, but that's part of normalization. This extended through the 1950s and 60s. Producers would insist records be louder so that their artists would stand out to the radio program directors, who probably got dozens of songs a day or whatever, and that one got my attention just because it was mastered louder. Artists themselves were starting to hear this difference, especially in the 60s and 70s, and especially because there were so many compilation albums that featured music from a bunch of artists, and some artists would realize, oh my God, my album was mixed way lower than so-and-so, which when you're listening to that singular album doesn't make a difference. But when you're mixing it with other music, oh boy, you can tell the difference. They would insist that their singles included on those compilations be mastered again and louder to be comparable to the loudest selections on those collections. As I discussed in my vinyl and audiophile episodes, however, vinyl and other formats of the day had severe limits on how much information they could retain, and that included how loud a track could be, because the louder the track, the bigger the wave, so the more space it took up. Not only that, records would skip if they were too loud. So the physically skip. So this limited how loud music could be for a couple more decades. But once the digital era began, sort of in recording, but even more so in format, that was even bigger, was in CDs. That limitation was removed, which is when the Loudness Wars started for real. Yes, digital also has a maximum possible loudness level, of course. It's not infinite, which is good because it's like an aural safeguard. Unlike in real life where sounds can be loud enough to damage your ears, If you're at a certain preset level of volume with something you're listening to digitally, not going to hurt your ears, even if it's louder, because there's a max level. But the max level, and especially the ability for digital media to contain more info and not skip, allowed producers to jack up the overall average volume of a song far beyond anything vinyl or cassette could handle. It's a technical note that this is achieved in a few ways, and I'll explain those tools in just a bit, including ways I've used them. As I discussed in the main episode, you can hear how this ramping up took effect simply by comparing 1980s and 1990s recordings. And I did that kind of A-B in the intro to that episode. Now, let's take a loud genre as an example, heavy metal. The loudest heavy metal in the 1980s, if left unremastered, as in its original form, sounds like it's lacking a thick bottom. It's thinner, it's tinnier, it's less impactful. Grating almost, and overall softer in volume than heavy metal from the 90s and beyond. An example from this era of an album exceeding the norm at the time is Guns N' Roses' Appetite for Destruction. It's still not a solid, the waveform itself is not a solid block. You'll see variations in it, so there's still some dynamic range, but it was far louder than anything else that had come before. And I'm going to give you some one-to-one examples and even a list of benchmark albums later on. At first, the CD was just another way to capture recordings, similar to vinyl and cassettes in the 80s. But when the 90s sank in, engineers, and others realized that the CD had far more capacity for storage and started to exploit that. Another good benchmark album for loudness was Nevermind. It was more compressed than ever before. And I'll go into what exactly compression is later on. By the mid-90s, the race was on and the loudness wars started for real because technology allowed them to. All the tech needed to achieve maximum volume effect had been established and almost uniformly employed. From this period, think of both of Oasis's first two albums. They raised the loudness stakes each time, and each one incrementally more. So now is the perfect time to discuss the technology that goes into making music louder. It breaks down into three realms: recording tools, the digital recording world in general, and the user interface. The first 2 of 5 coming up are recording tools. Number 1, brick wall digital limiters. The biggest technical trigger was the arrival of look-ahead brick wall limiters. These processors could detect an incoming peak milliseconds in advance and clamp it down before it exceeded 0 dB. Most famous example was the Waves L1 Ultra Maximizer, which was invented in 1994. I used some Waves plugins. This, of course, I believe was an actual outboard thing. It allowed mastering engineers to raise the overall level dramatically while preventing digital clipping. It limited the top volume. Peaks were flattened while the body of the mix was pushed louder. So softer things got louder and louder things were capped. This plugin alone is often cited as the single most important tool behind the loudness wars. So it was a plugin. And number 2, multiband compression. Multiband compressors split the audio spectrum into several frequency bands, the mids, the lows, the low mids, the highs, whatever, and compress them independently. A key tool was, again, Waves, C4 multiband compressor, allowed engineers to control bass, mids, and highs separately. You could tighten the low-end peaks without affecting everything else, compress vocals without flattening the cymbals, maintain a brightness while still pushing the overall level, which made extreme loudness possible without the mix completely falling apart. And I'm going to give you a clearer definition of what compression is when we get to the next part of the timeline, because it may not be what you think. These next 2 of 5 have to do with the digital recording realm. DAW-based mastering. By the early to mid-90s, mastering moved into digital audio workstations like Pro Tools, Sonic Solutions, Cakewalk. These synthesis systems allowed extremely precise editing, automation, and level maximization that would have been far harder with analog tape machines, and it meant that loudness decisions could be pushed further and more consistently across an entire album. Also, digital peak normalization, which we mentioned before. CD mastering software allowed engineers to easily normalize tracks so the loudest peak sat exactly at 0. This created a subtle... Now, if you're looking at volume meter. When you get above 0, you're in yellow or red, depending on the meter, usually red. You don't want that because that's when things are clipping, they're distorting, whatever. But if you can get to 0 all the time, then that's maximum loudness. So if one song peaked at 0, then all of them could. Another engineer could push the average level higher. So songs could get louder and louder while technically still obeying that digital limit. And finally, number 5, the user interface. MP3s and portable playback. The late 90s rise of MP3 players and portable listening, and especially in the 2000s, changed priorities. In the 2000s, Apple's iPod had limited amplification and were often used in noisy environments. So you compressed masters, you cut through the ambient noise more. They sounded subjectively louder and more present, even on earbuds and small speakers. And it reinforced the industry belief that maximum density translated better to real-world listening. Before we wrap, I will lay out some A-B examples of songs without and with loudness. But for now, let's get back to the timeline. So you had all this technology in play that was basically like too much power in the wrong hands. And those hands were everybody. Everybody who had the technology, which was, if you didn't have it, you wanted it. And by the time of the 2000s, you did have it. From this era, you can mark a few albums that were far louder than the previous norms. 1997's U2 album Pop was even louder than the Oasis albums. 1999's Red Hot Chili Peppers album Californication. And 2000's, Californication suffered from clipping and distortion because it was mastered too loud. And I'll explain that soon. And 2000's Britney Spears' Oops, I Did It Again set a new standard for how present pop music needed to be to cut through the noise. Pun intended. By the end of the 90s, as loud as possible was the standard. Or so we thought. When the 2000s hit, things got seriously out of control. This is when people started talking about compression. Well, everybody talked about compression. So a quick definition here. When you hear compression and you know anything about computers, you might be thinking of a zip file, compressing a wave into an MP3, a larger file into a smaller file, so you use less storage, zipping a bunch of files into one folder or whatever. A wave has 10 times more, information than an MP3, so MP3s are easier to store. That is file compression. I have nothing against that. That is very useful and has nothing to do with this compression that I'm talking about. This kind of compression is boosting the low and mid volume stuff so that it more evenly matches the highest volume stuff, making the volume of everything in a song more uniform. So if you refer to the waveforms on the graphic, if you're listening to this, just take a look at the graphic card for this episode. You'll see, and if you're watching this, I don't know, I can't help you. Maybe it's a bonus, so I don't usually do edits on the bonus, but hopefully go back to the beginning and check that. I don't know. Or look it up. You'll see that the last one, that bottom of the 3, is almost a solid thick band as compared to the others, which have varying degrees of peaks and valleys. So that last one, low volumes are high, mid volumes are high, high volumes are high. And with dynamic range, you allow certain things to retain their lower volumes, etc. By the mid to late 2000s, compression was so out of control that tracks were clipping, meaning hitting the preset limits of playback systems. And when that happens, you get fuzzy distortion, and not the chosen kind of distortion that you want. And clipping can also go. You'll hear that kind of stuff. Some examples are Metallica's 2003 album Saint Anger, which some say popularized the idea that consistently peak volume causes ear fatigue, which is true. The following year, Green Day's American Idiot had very dense sound, but I think done effectively well. Muse's 2006 album Black Holes and Revelations, limiting was very light, let's just say. But the big example from this era was Metallica's Death Magnetic, which I think was 2008. The official release had all that clipping and distortion. It was officially released with clipping and distortion, unlike other versions, say for Guitar Hero 3, which had the songs, but they're still powerful, but cleaner, more dynamic range. This was the peak of the loudness wars, and there was lots of criticism at the time. Afterwards, the standards started to shift, and in fact, there were already people in the industry by the late 2000s who were pushing back, such as how Guns N' Roses comeback, so-called comeback Chinese democracy, which was not worth the wait, sadly, they insisted that that was mastered with full dynamic range, shirking any thought of maximizing loudness, which means it's the perfect time to give you a list of music that will very well illustrate the changes. So first, that A-B list I talk about, I'll give you a pre-peak loudness song and then a post one. And either, write them down, dial them up, pause this, however you want to do it, take a listen. For alternative rock, 91 Smells Like Teen Spirit Nirvana was loud for its time, but when you compare it in its original form to the Red Hot Chili Peppers song Scar Tissue from 99, that just blows it away volume-wise. And that's not even a rock, kick-ass rock song. If you know Scar Tissue, it's more of an acoustic kind of a ballady song. And yet, overall volume is way louder than Smells Like Teen Spirit. It's crazy. 1993 Smashing Pumpkins Today, compared to 2004's Green Day's American Idiot. Today kicked. It had that bottom and it really had impact, but it had breathing and it allowed the drums to expand during the choruses. Not everything was pushed to the limit. American Idiot is mastered so hot that the drums and guitars are compressed super tight into a wall of sound. In the pop world, 1995, Mariah Carey's Fantasy still preserved a lot of the dynamic range and things punched more in certain areas. But by 2000's Oops, I Did It Again from Britney Spears, that entire song was pretty much at the limit of its time. 1997's Ray of Light, Madonna, still has a lot of dynamic lift when choruses come and things like that, and a lot of air around the mix. But 2008, Katy Perry's I Kissed a Girl was just up against the wall the entire time. In hip-hop, 1994's Gin and Juice, Snoop Dogg, leaves a lot of space around the drums. But 2003, 50 Cent's In the Club, hip-hop, it was pushed louder for club systems, but in a way that was so consistent that it did, cause ear fatigue. Metal, and this is one of the starkest examples. In 1991, Enter Sandman, Metallica, was already louder and thicker, let's just say, than previous Metallica albums. But nothing compared to 2008's And the Day That Never Comes from Death Magnetic, which sits near the maximum loudness the entire song. And that was a problem. One of the consensus ideas became at the time that things were too loud and compressed. And once that happened, the tide started to turn. And this was in the late 2000s and early 2010s. So it was also prompted by the rise of streaming services, which, had varying versions of normalization. If you were up against normalization, then you could only get to a certain level of volume. Normalization is when louder tracks are limited and softer tracks are boosted so that the overall listening experience is more uniform in volume. Though I will say it's still imperfect and there's a lot of variation. And as a music maker, I've learned that you need to be careful how loud you master your songs. And I'll talk more about that at the end of this bonus. An example of an album responding to this shift is Daft Punk's Random Access Memories from 2013. It's still very dynamic and present and loud, but it had more range. So it was reshifting back. From that point on, the backlash sank in and put us to where we are today, which is that music is far louder and more present across the spectrum than pre-90s music, but dynamic range has been restored just about across the board. I would say across the board. But I would say just about, only because genres like EDM, hip-hop, and pop still compress their stuff far more because they need to thump for clubs and such like than rock. Though even there, you're going to hear more dynamic range the way you wouldn't have similar songs from those genres in the 2000s. So what does this mean for music creators? So in the 90s and early 2000s, it didn't mean anything, really, because if your tracks were lower in volume or less compressed, people would just turn up the volume to match the norm. When streaming took hold, it became a freaking nightmare. Anything you did prior to the loudness being a big thing, you had to remaster because it would pale in comparison to everything else that was existing at the time. I remember the years when I was so consistently pissed that Rex music was so much lower in volume than most of whatever else was streaming, because I was using what was at the time an outdated standard and what now is, I guess, considered the standard. Things come back around. By the early 2010s, I was compressing things to the hilt. I kind of caught up with that, so, or maybe I was lagging. I don't know. But I was trying to compete and it still wasn't enough. And what I learned a few years later, and I talked about this a minute ago, was that if you master your songs too hot, the built-in normalization algorithms of the various streaming servers are going to lower the overall volume, putting you again in the place of being lower than everything else. So now I test all masters to make sure their average volumes won't be flagged by streaming services, and my later stuff has been far more competitive volume-wise. This is about something called LUFS, loudness units relative to full scale. It's meant to factor in how human ears perceive loudness rather than just the numerical measurement of it. So if a streaming service sets their normalization at negative 14 LUFS, which is the most common setting, Spotify, Tidal, YouTube, SoundCloud, and more, make sure the average overall volume of your song is optimally right at negative 14. And there are free online portals you can use to test this. When I master things for non-streaming, I give it another 3 LUFS. I go for negative 11. That's my sweet spot for volume. It's still not over-compressed, clipping, distorting, but it's more present and louder. So on Bandcamp, that's the level you're going to get. And by the way, if you're a recording artist and curious for mastering, I just use a light compression because I compress a lot of things anyway in the pre-mastering, the mixing. Some warming when appropriate, almost all the time, but when appropriate. A few tweaks of EQ if I need more bass presence, more vocal presence, whatever. And a limiter just to be safe, although that's probably doesn't do much. And I do all this just enough to increase the track's presence and overall volume while still preserving their dynamic range. I don't spend a lot of time and money on this, and I got to tell you, there's no such thing as perfection or an actual across-the-board accepted standard. Do not kill yourself with remastering. I once remastered a song like 8-10 times and was still unhappy with it. It was probably the first one was probably fine. And that's true for all of recording steps. There's a baseline level of good, and beyond that, there's so much variability that odds are your music is neither the best nor the worst. Just get it sounding like you want it and release it. I'd love to hear your thoughts on all of these. I hope you learned something here. I hope you're more curious about the Loudness Wars and about recording in general. I'd love to hear from you. As always, my objectives here are music, conversation, and connection. Thanks for hanging with me for this bonus MXtra on patreon.com/musicisnotagenre. Thank you for being a wonderful supporter, and I'll talk to you next week.